We're continuing with Chapter 10, Drug Regulation Builds on Trust. Economic theory predicts that firms will invest in corruption of the evidence base wherever its benefits exceed its costs. If detection is costly for regulators, corruption of the evidence base can be expected to be extensive. Alan Meinard, unpublished manuscript. Drug regulators have told me that the regulatory system builds on trust, which they think is fine, as it would have too serious consequences for the companies if they cheated and it was detected. As Meinard explains, this argument doesn't hold. Furthermore, as we have seen, big pharma means big crime, and where else in society would we trust what criminals tell us? Rats and toxicology studies may have never existed. They may have died more than once. They may be dead, although being described as being in good health in toxicology reports. Tissues may be missing, data may have been fabricated, and the animals may have died too early before they developed drug-induced cancers. Drug firms don't teach each other, but drug agencies are supposed to trust the entire drug industry. The authorities know perfectly well that they cannot trust the industry, and the reason they say the opposite is pragmatic. They cannot review more than a tiny fraction of the mountains of documents they receive. As an extreme example, one study report for a Tamiflu trial consisted of 8,545 pages, which is 1,000 times greater than its published version. Understandably, most regulators only read summaries most of the time, and to my knowledge, it is only the FDA that routinely does its own statistical analyses on the submitted data. But the EMA now intends to do the same. Many of the thousands of pages are pretty useless, and I have no doubt that the industry deliberately drowns the regulators in data, which gives the industry two advantages. First, they reduce the risk that the regulators detect anything that might prevent the drug from being approved, or might hamper sales because of warnings on the label. Second, if problems arise, the industry can claim they didn't conceal anything and that the regulators are therefore to blame. Although this isn't entirely true. It might work out in court. The regulators are apparently so overloaded that they don't even check that everything is there, which they should. We have found many examples that important appendices have been left out or that pages in the middle of a report were missing. Whole trials can also be missing. For example, 2 out of 7 negative studies of SSRIs in children, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, although this is against the law. It is not surprising that serious harms of new drugs may pass unnoticed, as they may be hidden so well in registration applications and other submissions that it would require time-consuming detective work to unravel them. An example of this is long-acting beta and agonists for treatment of asthma. In the 1990s, there were concerns that these drugs might increase asthma-related deaths rather than decrease them. And the FDA asked GlaxoSmithKline to carry out a large trial of salmeterol, the SMART trial. Glaxo's handling of the trial was a bit too smart, however, as the company manipulated the results it sent to the FDA. In 2003, the findings were presented at a meeting for chest physicians where Glaxo claimed that the results were inconclusive. But that was misleading. The Data and Safety Monitoring Board for the study had recommended its termination after 26,000 of the planned 60,000 patients had been enrolled, as there were more asthma-related deaths in the salmeterol arm than in the placebo arm, or alternatively, that 10,000 more patients were recruited. A trial period was 28 weeks, but the investigators could, if they wanted, report serious adverse effects that occurred in an additional 6-month period. The FDA assumed, of course, that the data they reviewed stemmed from the rigorously controlled randomized double-blind period. Only when the agency specifically queried the company as to which dataset had been provided did Glaxo reveal that it had included the 6-month follow-up data. That made a huge difference. There was no statistically significant increase in asthma-related deaths when the follow-up data were included, whereas the risk was 4 times higher when only the trial data were considered, which is statistically significant. Independent researchers concluded that, in the absence of the transparency associated with the advisory committee meetings at the FDA, these deceptions would never have come to public attention. Glaxo responded to the revelations by saying it had acted responsibly and transparently. That wasn't even all. Almost 3 years after the trial was finished, it still hadn't been published that SMART results confirmed the results of a large trial Glaxo had run and published already in 1993. Glaxo had compared salmeterol with its short-acting drug, salbutamol, and 3 times as many patients died from asthma when they received the long-acting drug. P equals 0.11 for the difference. In 2006, a meta-analysis including the SMART study confirmed that long-acting beta-agonists increase asthma-related deaths. At a superficial glance, the absolute risk of dying seems small, only 1 per 1,000 patients per year of use. However, salmeterol was only one of the most prescribed drugs in the world, and the increased risk translates into 4,000 to 5,000 extra asthma-related deaths every year in the United States alone. In 2005, the FDA considered whether long-acting beta-agonists should be removed from the market, but instead, the agency opted for strong warnings and a recommendation that the drugs should only be used after other asthma drugs had failed. In 2010, the FDA warned again, this time about the increased risk of severe exacerbation of asthma symptoms, leading to hospitalization and death, and said that these drugs must never be taken alone, but should be combined with an inhaled corticosteroid. However, it doesn't solve the problem to add inhaled corticosteroids. For example, the risk of admission to hospital is still increased 2-fold. The FDA also requires the manufacturers to conduct additional clinical trials to further evaluate the safety of these drugs when used in combination with inhaled corticosteroids. I find this odd. FDA requirements of additional studies are usually ignored by the companies, and the FDA doesn't enforce them. These drugs are dangerous, likely also when combined with steroids, and we don't need them. So why not take them off the market? When Glaxo finally published the SMART trial in the ch10, they mentioned the increase in asthma-related deaths, but the last 2 sentences in the abstract were interesting. Subgroup analyses suggest the risk may be greater in African Americans compared with Caucasian subjects. Whether this risk is due to factors including, but not limited to, a physiologic treatment effect, genetic factors, or patient behaviors leading to poor outcomes remains unknown. Smoke and mirrors and the paper stinks. Subpopulations were based on baseline characteristics such as, my emphasis, inhaled corticosteroids, ICS, use and study phase. Additionally, outcomes, events Additionally, outcome events were analyzed separately for white and African American subjects, such as Glaxo doesn't even tell us how many times they messaged. Okay. Glaxo doesn't even tell us how many times they massaged the data before they found a subgroup result they could use to fool the readers into believing that the drug was only harmful for African Americans. Even the data massage itself was misleading. There wasn't a test of interaction, which is what one needs to do before one can say there is a difference between the results in two subgroups. And, in fact, the relative risk for asthma-related deaths was very similar for Caucasians and African Americans. The discussion section of the paper tells us about only one of the subgroups, which is misleading. Post hoc analyses showed no significant differences between treatments. In the Caucasian population, Glaxo converted a clear harm into no harm. Words fail me, but it says a lot about why we cannot trust industry-sponsored trials. 2 of the 5 authors were Glaxo employees, and the other 3 were on Glaxo payroll. Fox in the henhouse. It seems that Glaxo did what it could to protect its drug rather than the patients. In a scathing editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, the editorial explained that Glaxo refused to provide a placebo inhaler for an National Institute of Health trial of Samatrol. The investigators had to spend $900,000 of taxpayers' money to repackage the active drug and to create a visually identical placebo for use in the trial. The editors furthermore wrote, Glaxo's stated goal is to improve the quality of human life, but companies are able to develop and sell their treatments only because they can tap into a community resource. Patients who are willing to put themselves at risk as they participate in clinical trials. Companies, for their part, must therefore be willing to put their products at risk by providing them to legitimate third parties for study. Failure to do so is an unacceptable double standard. Drug companies may not only cheat the authorities in their submissions, they may also lie when questioned directly. In documents prepared for a 2005 FDA hearing, Pfizer denied that its NSAID, Celoxib, causes heart attacks, based on an analysis of 44,000 patients, but big numbers offered by the industry when it is on the defensive are often deceptive. Pfizer had unpublished evidence to the contrary. For example, a 1999 trial in Alzheimer's disease, and a Pfizer official admitted in an interview that its analyses didn't include outside studies that indicated its drug causes heart problems. One such study, which Pfizer knew about, was conducted by the NIH and had been terminated after finding that high doses of Celoxib more than tripled the incidence of heart attacks and strokes. Other companies have also deceived the FDA by hiding studies and results showing that their drugs cause lethal harms. There is one other reason why we know too little about the harms of drugs. Clinicians are supposed to report serious adverse events to the authorities, but a common estimate is that only about 1% of such events gets reported. Doctors are busy and may tend to think that an event isn't drug-related and dismiss it as this is convenient for them. If they report an event, they may learn never to do it again, as they may get harassed by a drug representative who keeps coming back with all sorts of questions about the patient, other drugs the patient was taking, etc. No one is really interested in harms, it seems, apart from the victim. When I worked at a department of infectious diseases, I learned why many serious events in industry-funded AIDS trials didn't get reported. The record forms were long and complicated, and we didn't have time for endless discussions with the drug company. Inadequate testing of new drugs. When I lecture doctors in training to become clinical pharmacologists and explain why the regulatory demands for new drugs are inadequate and cannot ensure effective and safe drugs, and how the drug industry often manipulates its research, I'm met with mixed reactions. Some agree heartily, and others are quite hostile, as if I had explained to a child that Santa Claus doesn't exist. This worries me, as these are the doctors who are most likely to get jobs in drug agencies and in the drug industry. I sometimes get the feeling that it's already too late to talk sense to them. We could easily do far better than we are currently doing in protecting public health and avoiding wasting our money, and I shall give some examples. Only 2 placebo-controlled trials showing an effect isn't enough. Drug agencies consider efficacy to have been demonstrated if 2 placebo-controlled trials have shown an effect. As explained in Chapter 4, this is fairly easy to do for almost any drug for any condition because drugs have side effects, which will be expected to bias the assessment of a subjective outcome. If the sample size is large enough, any effect will become statistically significant, and the drug will be approved if not too toxic. If the company didn't succeed in the first 2 tries, it can perform more trials until 2 of them confess. On this background, it's amusing that the Danish Minister of Health, after having consulted with a drug agency, replies to a politician that there is no requirement that a drug needs to be better than an existing drug to become approved, but it must be at least equally good. An existing drug to become approved, but it must be at least equally good, and under no circumstances worse than existing drugs. However, when only placebo-controlled trials are needed, we have no way of knowing whether new drugs are worse than existing ones. Companies are obliged by law to submit all trials they have carried out when they ask for drug approval. But the problem with this is that we cannot trust the drug companies. Trials may be missing, and if they were conducted in countries with little public oversight, it might be impossible to know they existed. Cough medicines don't work, but the drug industry has nevertheless succeeded getting hordes of medicines approved for cough, and the sales are high. No less than 20% of all children up to 4 years are treated with asthma drugs such as tetracycline, which shows that the shady marketing I participated in when I worked for Astra was highly effective. In the United States, over-the-counter cough-cold medications were used by 39% of households during 3 years. Many of the drugs came on the market before 1972, when there were little controls with medicines. But poison control centers had reported more than 75,000 calls of concern in 7 years related to such base. Adverse effects of the drugs include cardiac arrhythmias, hallucinations, depressed consciousness, and encephalopathy. Manufacturers' advertisements describe the drugs as safe and effective, both of which are untrue. A petition required the FDA to review the drugs, but the manufacturers claimed that the injuries could be prevented through parent education, which is a horrendous lie. In 2011, the FDA announced that the product shouldn't be used in children below 2 years of age, and that the FDA strongly supports the actions taken by many pharmaceutical manufacturers to voluntarily withdraw cough and cold medicines that were being sold for use in this age group. Why didn't the FDA withdraw these useless and potentially dangerous products from the market? And why, after 4 years, was the FDA still reviewing the safety and expected to communicate its recommendations in the near future, as they said? Not even when useless drugs kill our children do the regulators act, whereas they have withdrawn many effective products, even though they have caused fewer deaths. Drug regulation is not a consistent enterprise. I once discussed cough remedies with a drug regulator, and he alerted me to studies included in a registration application that purported to have shown that the drugs worked. It is one of the weirdest papers I've ever seen, and I have seen a lot. The studies have been carried out in India, a sensitive miniature microphone developed by Procter & Gamble attached to a patient's nose registered every little sound that perhaps was or could develop into a cough. All 3 drugs tested, eusifacine, brohomixine, and dextromethorphan, had an effect. Surprise, surprise, these recordings were completely irrelevant for the patients. 2 of the drugs also increased septum volume. What are we to make out of that? If they increased septum production, they would also increase expectorant effects, measured as septum volume. But that would not be a beneficial but a harmful effect. The studies were published in Pulmonary Pharmacology, an obscure journal I'd never heard about. It's not the regulators' fault that they have to accept such nonsense. It's the politicians' fault that they had not required outcomes that mattered to patients. Drug trials in countries with widespread corruption. Nowadays, drug trials are outsourced more and more to countries with little oversight and widespread corruption. How are we to know whether the results have been made up when we have no possibility of controlling the trials? Despite considerable opposition from scientists, ethicists, and Consumer Reports, the FDA decided in 2008 that clinical trials performed outside the United States no longer had to conform to the Declaration of Helsinki if used to support applications for registration of products in the US. Pardon me, but have they gone completely mad at the FDA? Has the FDA leadership never heard about the Nuremberg processes? Or about the medical experiments on US prisoners where the Declaration of Helsinki wasn't an issue? Or about the Tuskegee affair where researchers in Alabama followed 399 black men infected with syphilis without treating them for 40 years to study the natural course of the disease while preventing them from accessing treatment programs available to others. And while many died of syphilis, wives contracted the disease, and children were born with congenital syphilis. Or that drug companies do research in poor countries for particularly dangerous drugs because peasants don't sue big corporations for injury and because informed consent regulations either don't exist or are weakly enforced. The most well-known example of the use of the third world guinea pigs is oral contraceptives, which were first tested in Puerto Rico, later in Haiti and Mexico, and when tested in the United States, poor people were chosen, 90% of whom were either Mexican or African origins. In contrast to this indefensible move, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled shortly afterwards that the Declaration of Helsinki constituted a sufficient customary norm to be considered binding in Pfizer's meningitis trial in Nigeria, where the parents didn't know that their children participated in a trial. The court reversed a dismissal by a lower court of a lawsuit by families of children who died or were injured while they received Pfizer's experimental antibiotic, trovafloxacin. Although a better drug was freely available through Médecins Sans Frontières, Pfizer hired investigators to look for evidence of corruption against the Nigerian Attorney General in an effort to persuade him to drop the legal action. It didn't work out, and Pfizer had to pay compensation to families whose children died. The drug was never intended for Africa. Pfizer planned to sell it in the United States and Europe, but its license was withdrawn in Europe because of concerns of over liver toxicity. An effect on surrogate outcome isn't enough. One of the most harmful practices in drug regulation is to approve drugs based on their effects on surrogate outcomes. As this mistake has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands, or perhaps even millions of patients, see below, it's difficult to understand that the regulators don't require proven effects on relevant outcomes. Here's an example. When I had been a doctor for only 2 years, I diagnosed mild type 2 diabetes in an old man that had been admitted for something else to the Department of Hepatology where I worked. I wrote in his files that it was common practice to start treatment with torbutamide. But since the only large trial of torbutamide ever performed was stopped prematurely because of an excess of cardiovascular deaths, and since those patients who took most of their daily doses were also those that had the highest event rate, I decided not to institute treatment with tolbutamide. My superior in the hierarchy blew me up when he saw my notes. How dare you not start tolbutamide in violation of the guidelines the endocrinologists have written? I explained calmly but firmly that I knew more about this drug than the endocrinologists because I had read the trial report carefully, plus the many articles and letters that followed, and also a book that discussed the issues. The study, the University Group Diabetes Project, UGDP, had been carried out independently of the drug industry, and it had been heavily debated and reanalyzed by several other groups and those who conducted the study. I had no doubt about who were right. Tolbutamide lowers blood glucose, but this is a surrogate outcome. We don't treat patients to lower their blood glucose. We treat them to prevent complications to diabetes, in particular cardiovascular ones. I therefore considered it absurd, and still do, that people use this drug when the only trial studying cardiovascular complications was stopped because the drug killed the patients. It was particularly convincing that good compliers with tolbutamide had a greater mortality rate than poor compliers, because patients who do what they are told are generally more healthy than others, and therefore have better survival even when the drug is a placebo. A trial of a lipid-lowering agent, colefibrate, demonstrated this. There was no difference in mortality between drug and placebo, but among those who took more than 80% of the drug, only 15% died, compared to 25% among the rest. P equals 0.0001. This doesn't prove that the drug works, of course, and the same difference was seen in the group that received placebo, 15% versus 28%. I'm not reading out this shit. Upjohn, the marker of tolbutamide, launched an aggressive campaign to discredit the UGDP study findings by using leading and well-remunerated academics, and the arguments became increasingly ad hominem. Lawsuits were brought by the company to prevent the FDA from mentioning the study's results in the package inserts, and the FDA was even forced to carry out an investigation that concluded that the data in the study hadn't been falsified. The use of tolbutamide should have been stopped by withdrawing the drug from the market, at least temporarily, while those who were skeptical toward the trial's results conducted another trial. But the FDA never required Upjohn to do this, and it was never done. No one seems willing to learn anything, or at least not much from history, when it comes to drug regulation. History repeats itself all the time. For the next 40 years after the UGDP trial, industry simply stopped performing trials that might have revealed that their diabetes drugs increased cardiovascular events. And our drug regulators let them get away with this, which is pretty scandalous. Progesterone is a recent example of a diabetes drug that was approved based on its effects on blood glucose. But as this drug also increased the cardiovascular complications it was supposed to prevent, it was taken off the market in Europe in 2010 after having killed thousands of patients. See Chapter 16. Similarly, stories can be told from other therapeutic areas. A cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial, CAST, was stopped prematurely because the two active drugs, encinide and felsinide, killed the patients. The trial was originally designed as one-sided, which means that the drug can only be beneficial or neutral, since the cardiologist couldn't imagine that the treatments could be harmful. At the peak of their use in the late 1980s, antiarrhythmic drugs were likely causing about 50,000 deaths every year in the United States alone, which is of the same order of magnitude as the total number of Americans who died in the Vietnam War. The drugs were widely used because they had an effect on a surrogate outcome, the ECG, and although the FDA had serious safety concerns, they gave in to the pressures of the companies, which quite predictably led to the drugs being used in many completely healthy people with benign rhythm disturbances that many of us have. Tumor shrinkage is another popular but misleading surrogate outcome. Cancer patients' primary interest is to stay alive, but some treatments that reduce the size of the cancer increase mortality. For example, radiotherapy in women who had their breast cancer diagnosed at screening. This can be said about many, if not most, cancer drugs. High doses may have better effect on the cancer, but may also kill more patients. If the dose is high enough, all cancers will die, but so will all patients. This shows how absurd this surrogate outcome is. In 2008, the FDA granted bevacizumab Avastin accelerated approval for treatment of metastatic breast cancer, although it didn't increase survival, only progression-free survival. This is not only a surrogate outcome, but also one that is prone to bias, as it is pretty subjective to decide whether progesterone has occurred. As it is pretty subjective to decide whether progression has occurred. The FDA obligated the company to conduct more trials, and these didn't show an effect on progression-free survival, whereas they showed serious harms, including deaths. 3 years later, the drug, which costs the same every year as several new cars, about $88,000, was revoked for breast cancer. Such a criminal. That's all I'm doing for today.